Good morning everyone and welcome to another episode of The Maths Mum. Today I am explaining multiplication and division. This video is going to be split up into separate parts, so I'm going to do the early stages first and then I'm going to explain multiplication and division, and then I'm also going to do long multiplication and long division in a separate video, some demonstrations. This is a booklet that I'm about to release, which is 26 pages long, but it covers multiplication, everything you need to know from reception to year 6, with examples and explanations in it, and this booklet accompanies this video. Okay, so again the curriculum changed, so the way in which we introduce multiplication and division has slightly changed, although not as drastic as addition and subtraction. So the first thing we talk about is, in reception, we talk about concrete things. So when we learn to count, the next thing we do when we start introducing this idea of more than and less than, we introduce the concept of doubling and halving. Okay, so I've got 4 green objects. I've got 8 green objects. 4 doubled is 8, 8 halved is 4. And then look at the concrete objects and they'll compare. You might be given 2 and said double it, so you know you need to go and find the same amount, so match them up. So the idea behind this is this concept of halving and doubling is introduced. Obviously the first thing then you realise is halving and doubling when you start talking about multiplication is multiplying by 2 and dividing by 2. Okay, but why do we use multiplication? What on earth is multiplication about? Well, basically it is actually an easier way of counting. What happens is when we look at objects, we can see up to about 5 objects before we have to count them. So what I mean by that, look, I've got an example here, is if I pull out a couple of these without counting, you know that you've got 3 of them. You can see that you've got 4 of them. Yeah? You can see that no matter what I put them in, you probably can guess that I've got 5. But once you get to a greater amount of number, you don't know how many I have without counting them. Okay? So what we do then is we learn to group and count. So if I were doing this, so I'm going to take it back to, I have 6. So if I were doing this and I had this amount, what I might be inclined to do is group it like this. So suddenly I have got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've got 2, 4, 6, or 3, 6. So I've actually got 2 groups of 3 or 3 groups of 2. So I start counting in a quicker way. Instead of counting individually 1 to 6, I go 2, 4, 6, counting in pairs. Okay? And that is exactly how multiplication is introduced as grouping, an easier way to group objects to count how many you have when you have over 5 objects. Okay, so just if I put these into, so I've got them here, if I put them into an order like this, it makes it, excuse me, it makes it so much easier to be able to see how many I have. Suddenly I've got 4 groups of 3 or 3 groups of 4. So I know I have 12 in total because I know that 3 times 4 is 12. But initially I'm going to be talking about repeated addition. So I'm going to go 3, 6, 9, 12. I'm going to add on. And that is exactly what we start with. So we start multiplication, we group, we create this. This is called an array. An array is when you line up objects in an orderly fashion across and down. I always come back to it as the best example of describing an array is, think of it at Christmas when you receive that large box of Ferrero Rocher and you want to work out how many you have. You count up across and down and you multiply them out, because Ferrero Rocher handily come largely in a nicely organised array. So that is what an array is. I'm moving ahead now to, let me just make sure. So You can see when we have these arrays, when we order numbers in an orderly fashion like this, then it is important that we can count up in. So for instance, I can count up in threes, 3, 6, 9, 12 to get to my answer, or I can count up in fours, 4, 8, 12. But it is important to count up in numbers. So that is exactly the next stage of this idea of multiplication and division that we do starting in year 1. We start looking at number sequences, counting in twos, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. We also, these are all on the worksheet, we also do counting in tens, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. In Key Stage 1, we also count in fives, 5, 10, 15, 20. And the last one we do counting on in is counting on in threes. Now I have a trick for you, I'm going to have to get close, but you have 3 lines in your finger, so you can count up in threes. Learn to count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So suddenly you've got 30 on your hand rather than just 10. But counting in threes, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. And what we do is, in schools, we use the number line to create these. So we skip ahead, we look at counting in threes as 0, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. And then we create our own number lines, okay? So we create our own number lines, dropping out all the bits in between and just have the number line series of counting in threes. You can see where this is going because counting in threes, if I know that series, when it comes to it, I'll know my times tables in threes. So what we actually do then is in the start of year 3, we do counting on sequences and the rest of the numbers. So we do 4s, 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 25s, 50s and thousands. So we create all these number lines and we get used to these number sequences. And it's really powerful because if you actually know this number sequence, it means when you actually come to your times tables, if you remember the number sequence, all you need to do is remember some of the anchor points, which we'll cover later on, and you can remember your times tables. So sequences are really important. Okay. So then I'm going to skip on. So my notebook does do into more multiplication, but I'm actually going to go and look at sharing at a basic level now. So sharing is caring. Sharing is also division. Okay, so children start, I always laugh and think, children know sharing. If you have siblings in your house, they understand sharing. They may not understand the concept of sharing equally, but they do understand sharing. So the idea behind it is we actually have our 8 items, okay? And I ask you to share them equally. And what you do is you go 1 for you, 1 for me, 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 and you get 4 in each. So what you've done is you have shared 8 equally amongst 2 people. You have taken 8 and divided it by 2. You can also do sharing on a number line because what you can do is you can actually look at something like 8 and then jump back half and jump back half again, so you can actually see where you're going. But division, apart from sharing, is also repeated subtraction. So we looked at multiplication as repeated addition. Dividing is repeated subtraction. So if I take away, so for instance, on my number line, I've got an example here where I have 12 divided by 6. So I'm asking how many times can I take away 6 from 12? I start at 12 on my number line. I take 6 off, I get to 6. I take another 6 off, I get to 0. I have gone 2 jumps. So my answer is 2. I can take away 6 from 12 2 times. So 12 divided by 6 is 2. Okay. We then move on to greater numbers. We use sharing circles. So I've cut these out and you can do this at home. I have just made circles out of coloured paper. And what I do is if I'm dividing by 4, I'll put my 4 circles out. Okay. So I have 4 circles. And then I will divide equally and place them round equally. And this is what we call sharing in a concrete fashion. So you can take any amount. These are my assisting maths aids when it comes to division. Sweets are brilliant. But you go one for you, 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 and you divide them up equally amongst your sharing circles. The thing about this is, I have looked at worksheets on sharing circles. You have to be really, really careful, and I've put two examples on here. One is just black dots, and it asks you to share them. Okay, so it's straightforward, put a black dot in. This one here, which you can't see in detail, but I'll read you it. Charlie, Chaz and Chuck all like cakes. Share these cakes equally between them by drawing them next to the chimps. The thing about this is, if you've got a child who wants to prevaricate, they will draw amazing cupcakes. They may even put sprinkles on top, sparkles, colourful. Just beware that sharing circles is a means to an end. It takes time to do them and it's not very efficient. So be careful when you're picking out worksheets that you don't have one that you can spend 40 minutes doing one question on. So this is the first video, this is part one, and what we've done now is cover multiplication and division, the early stages, working up to key stage 2. So at the moment we've done everything that we've covered to key stage 1, and at the end of key stage 1 we are expected to know our 2, 5 and 10 times tables. Okay,